Really excited to welcome everyone here today. On behalf of the Center for Digital Strategies and Tuck, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Amy Winecoff. So Amy is a research fellow at Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy and the Center for Statistics and Machine Learning. She also serves on the advisory board of the eLab Startup Accelerator program hosted by Princeton's Keller Center for Innovation in Engineering Education. Her research focuses on human algorithm interactions, taking into consideration how humans both shape and react to algorithms. She conducts research on how psychological, social, and institutional forces shape how entrepreneurs develop algorithmic systems, as well as how algorithmic systems adapt to idiosyncratic user-level behavior, broader social influences over time. Prior to joining Princeton, she worked as an assistant professor of psychology at Bard College and as a data scientist for e-commerce technology companies, where she developed large-scale machine learning systems for providing product recommendations. She's published numerous academic articles and book chapters on psychology, neuroscience, machine learning, and human-computer interaction. She graduated from North Carolina State University and earned a Ph.D. in neuroscience and psychology from Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Amy Winecoff to Tuck. Really briefly before we get started, as you know, we've got a lot of programming and a lot of interest in the AI space this spring. I'm also really excited to announce that at a to-be-determined date later in the second half of this spring term, Professor Taylor, faculty director right there, will be teaching a sprint course on generative AI. So it's hot off the presses, so to speak, and approved by the registrar and everyone. So really excited for this space and really excited for Amy to join us today. I'll turn over to you, Amy.
Yeah.
All your show.
Okay. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk with you all. The advertised title of this talk was The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, and as is almost nearly always the case, I thought of a better title later, and I think this will embody the approach that I'm going to be advocating for here today, which is how to build slightly less evil AI. Do I point here? Oh, just a quick note, we're going to be doing an interactive portion of this talk today, discussing AI as applied to mental health use cases, so take care of yourself, whatever that means for you. Right, so Patrick already introduced my research a little bit. Much as I would personally love to bloviate on about my research and all of its academic components, I don't think that would be very interesting or useful to you all. But what I will start with is a high-level insight from the research that I've done. Over the past 3 years, I've had in-depth conversation with hundreds of technology professionals, mostly in the AI space, although also in the blockchain space as well. So what I talk to them about is what are the values that they hold dearly, and in what ways or what do they perceive as either opportunities or obstacles for developing and building those values into their technology that they're working on. In these conversations, of course, it's a self-selecting group, so that's the caveat, but it is almost never the case that no one cares about any sort of broader ethical, social, or political value. In fact, I've only ever interviewed one person that openly admitted that he did not care about ethics whatsoever. So it's pretty common for people to care about something other than their business goals or their technology goals. That said, the overwhelming majority of people that I have interviewed have not built those values into their design process, not thought about how their technology itself might stem out of those values, not discussed how organizational processes might be shaped as a way to better embed those values, nor in almost all cases have they ever even had an explicit conversation with their coworkers and co-founders about what they care about. Literally the most basic thing that one could do, most of these folks have not done. It does not follow, therefore, that values don't become embedded in what you build anyway. People build technologies. The choices that you make are going to be some sort of embodiment of what you care about, whether you talk about it or not. What happens, though, when you begin to talk about it and design around it and make explicit decisions is you're more likely to build technologies and processes that are consistent with your values. You're less likely to have ethical outcomes that are an accident. So you can't perfectly embody all of your values, but if you're going to come into this space, you might as well, at a bare minimum, be deliberate about it. So I'm going to try to give you guys some tools today for thinking about how you might do that within the scope of a 50-minute talk. Okay, so you're probably not living under a rock, so I'm going to assume that you're all familiar with lots of these splashy headlines and developments and using the tools themselves, particularly around large language models, but also generative image models. Lots of lofty claims about what these technologies can do, and a lot of like equally lofty claims about the harms that are going to be caused by these technologies. So misinformation is one that's received a lot of attention. Bias in image models has received a lot of attention as well. And these are things that have come out over the last year or less. That said, these types of ethical implications of AI are not new to this current class of models. It has been nearly a decade since these types of concerns have begun to surface about machine learning models. You may be familiar, for example, of the instance where Google image captioning labeled images of black people as gorillas, or you may be familiar with Flickr's model doing a similar thing, labeling Holocaust sites as jungle gyms. Other examples of bias in screening tools in AI's resume screening process, where they eliminated candidates that came from women's colleges. There are a lot of ways that the data itself can embed social biases into these models and create problems that are undesirable ethically and also from a business perspective. So these are the types of things that people have been studying for a while. So how do we begin to build machine learning or AI models that might move in the direction of embodying some values that we care about and move away from the direction of embodying values that we don't want them to have? There's a recent meta-analysis that I put up here, and I'll give you a link to these slides later, that surveyed all of these sorts of ethical AI frameworks out there. There are over 100 principles, technical tools, frameworks for thinking through this stuff. Those are very interesting and fun. You can peruse them on your own. Today I'm going to be talking about an approach called value-sensitive design. This is a model that's a principled approach to thinking through how we might incorporate human values into the design, development, and iteration process for building technologies from those ethical principles or personal values. I've chosen this for a couple of reasons to talk about today. The first is that it's not prescriptive. So it's not going to tell you these are the values that you should embody. There's a recognition that different people are going to care about different things. Organizations are going to choose to prioritize different types of ethical values. So it's not going to tell you what values one ought to hold. It offers a framework for thinking through how do you prioritize the values that you do hold. It acknowledges as well that values and priorities, they're not always going to like perfectly line up in this way where you can build beautifully privacy-preserving technologies that are fair and that are inclusive and that also are sell to someone that will actually buy your product. You're not going to probably be able to realize all of these things all at once. So it offers some ideas about how to work through some of these conflicts. And to the title of my talk, I'm building slightly less evil AI. It focuses on progress, not perfection. You're here at a business school because you actually want to do a thing, not because you're trying not to do a thing. So it's unreasonable to expect that you're going to achieve some sort of perfect status. That said, there are a lot of incremental benefits that are cumulative from working on these types of small advances to move you in the direction that you might like to go. So the goal is not to achieve this perfection state, but also just to make progress towards it, and you'll learn in the process. So value-sensitive design offers a lot of different tools that I considered bringing up today. Something like 17 different techniques exist for doing it. We won't be able to do all of that today, so I'm going to focus on sort of the core 2 types of thoughts that are important for doing value-sensitive design. You will probably already be familiar with the idea of a stakeholder analysis. So where value-sensitive design differs from this is that it parcels out different kinds of stakeholders in the system. So from this framework, direct stakeholders are stakeholders who directly interact with the technology. So the most obvious one would be your end user, but this might also include developers, hackers, designers, and maybe administrators, depending on the kind of system that you're building. It also, though, talks about indirect stakeholders. So indirect stakeholders are people that themselves do not interact with the technology, but are still affected by that technology in an indirect way. So this could include an advocacy group, it could be a family, it could be a regulator, society at large. Sometimes people will bring up things like environmental entities, so maybe there are whales and they're an indirect stakeholder of some particular kind of technology, that stuff as well. One example that's particularly relevant in the AI case for an indirect stakeholder would be a data subject. So for example, you can imagine that if someone is building a shopping analytics platform, they might get data traces that have timestamps, interaction information from online retailers, and then use that information to provide some sort of B2B analytical service. The users in that case that generated that data don't use the service, but they're nevertheless affected because their data goes into building it. So they have a stake, albeit indirect, in that particular product. The last is excluded stakeholders. So these are people who do not use the technology. They actively choose to not use the technology, or they're not able to use the technology. So this could be physical, cognitive, social constraints, other situational constraints. It could be a personal choice, but that still may be impacted even though the technology doesn't have any sort of impact on them directly or indirectly. So just to give you a little bit more concreteness around this, imagine that there is an electronic health record system that providers use for billing and maintaining patient records that only the providers have access to. The direct stakeholders in this case would be doctors, because they use it to access patient records, take notes, read notes from prior appointments, those types of things. Same would go for nurses, for example. If the insurance companies also use these records to do billing, they would also be direct stakeholders. Maybe there are cases where researchers might get granted access to that data in that system as well, and maybe that would also be the case for regulators that are trying to ensure HIPAA compliance. Indirect stakeholders in this case, if this is only for providers, would be patients, because they don't directly interact with the medical record system itself. This would also be the case for family members of patients, since they're still affected by that patient's health. Excluded stakeholders in this case might be practitioners that are working in a case that doesn't have internet access, or a cellular network. Probably not relevant for this, but it is still a case where that may be the case in some settings where this system might not function. Users with low vision, if there are not accessibility considerations built into the system, then they will necessarily be excluded from this particular technology. And we'll do more work on this a little bit later. The second technique that we're going to be drawing from today is a value analysis from value-sensitive design. So the goal of this is to try to figure out what are the values that are at play. Now, in an ideal situation, you would go and, after you've identified your stakeholder groups, is go talk to those people. That would be the ideal way to elicit what these values are. Probably that's not feasible in all cases, so barring the ability to talk to stakeholders directly, you might consult prior research, policy documents, any other way to get a reasonably moderate to high fidelity signal about what these particular stakeholders care about. Given that you have that data, probably you're going to have more values than can be reasonably accommodated, so you would probably select some and figure out operational definitions for those values that are relevant to the context at hand. So it's one thing to say, we want technology to be inclusive. It's another thing to say, we want this technology to be inclusive for this particular system, and this is what we mean by inclusivity. A last thing that's sometimes suggested as a way to think through this is once you have these operational definitions, is to identify what the source of these values is. So there are going to be some values that are explicitly prioritized by the project itself. So it's a project goal, maybe it's tied to funding sources, maybe it's a guiding principle of the organization itself for how they operate. In other cases, you might have the personal values of the people that are building that technology. So the designers of a technology or the engineers. And the last case is the other stakeholders. So the other stakeholders that you've identified, which values correspond to those stakeholders. That can be useful because it helps orient people towards the design process and thinking through where there may be benefits, to whom might be benefiting, and where there might be harms, and so forth. So this is totally hypothetical. Don't hold me to a hypothetical system. Let's say we did actually talk to stakeholder groups and elicited some values, and we find out that doctors value paternalism. So this is the idea that they want to do what they know to be medically in the best interest of the patient, often with limited input from the patient themselves about what their personal desires are. Patients, on the other hand, are probably pretty likely to value autonomy. They want access to their information, and they want agency over how choices about their medical treatment are being made. Lastly, engineers might value security. So they want to protect against accidental data leaks, and therefore maybe want to constrain the access to credentialed providers. In this case, there's like a pretty obvious conflict between the doctor's desire for paternalism and the patient's desire for autonomy. You're not going to be able, probably, to satisfy both entirely. That said, you may be able to work with your design team to think through, well, what are some ways that we can provide some access to patients about their data so that they're able to access what's been done about them in the past and what choices were made without providing them with the full access to all of their medical information, especially if that information can only be meaningfully interpreted in conjunction with the provider. So that might be a way that you could think through how could we prioritize some of these things, at least a little bit, through the features that we build into the product. Yes?
Two questions. The first question was around the example you gave where you had hacker as part of us as a stakeholder in the system, and that's generally not how we would think of a stakeholder.
Sure.
If you could sort of help me understand that a little bit. And the second thing with this is, how do you think about when the underlying population, whether patient, doctors, or some other category, is heterogeneous, right? And so so it may be hard to come up with sort of the general value.
Yeah. So the first question about hackers. I spoke to you about this earlier. There's kind of like different sorts of hackers. So sometimes people are white hat hackers where they're hired intentionally to try to exploit weaknesses in systems and are often rewarded for doing those. Things like bug bounties and stuff like this to try to test the system. That might be a stakeholder where they're, in some sense, they're also a service provider, but it is still somebody's like hacking. Maybe in a more general sense, somebody might mean hacker by somebody that's using, not for any nefarious purpose, a technology that's available open source. We might call that person a hacker. They still then become an end user of a technology that's put out into the public domain for open source code. In other ways, like maybe it is somebody with a nefarious intent, it can still be useful to think through what might a hacker want to exploit our system to do? What would be their goal in doing so? Number one, because it helps you mitigate against what that might be. Granted, if you don't hire somebody professionally to do that, that might be difficult to anticipate, but sometimes even just verbalizing what that might mean would help you think through that. Now, it's not to say, some stakeholders, you intentionally don't want to prioritize their values. If there's the hacker, it's I want to gain access to personal financial data and put it on the internet, that is a value that you want to downgrade in your system compared to the value of safety and security. So that was your first question. Maybe at least partially addressed. And then the second question was, heterogeneous stakeholder groups. This is really tough. You know, you don't want to make over general assumptions about any particular group. There may be a ton of heterogeneity. In that case, like ideally, you would have elicited at least like one opinion from the different types of stakeholders in a group. If it's not the case that there's any sort of commonality within that group, maybe your groupings are wrong and there's like a different axis along which you should be thinking about stakeholders. Again, you're not going to be able to prioritize everything, but doing something is a good goal because doing something is usually better than nothing. Okay, so we're going to be talking about AI today. I feel a little bit weird about using that word. I tend to not use it in my personal work when I'm building machine learning models. I'm going to use it today because I've heard from many entrepreneurs that it's sexy and people care about it, and the fact that all of you guys are here and this is a full room, clearly they're right. That said, there is not a consensus definition of what AI means. So different people, when you ask them about this, might say, well, it's a system that thinks or behaves the way a human behaves. Other people, particularly computer scientists, will say it's a system that behaves rationally or better than humans might behave. If you ask policymakers, they don't really know. So that's its own group. Not all. I mean, this is like a general statement. You should read the paper. Don't quote me on that. But they tend to emphasize more of this like thinking and behaving like humans or care about some of these other contexts that don't necessarily play into a technical definition. I've done research with a lot of AI startup entrepreneurs, and they hate me even asking a question about this. And before I can even like get it out of my mouth, AI is not real. We use it as a marketing term. People use it that don't actually build real models. So in that case, it's an instrumental tool for hyping things up to their consumer bases. That said, I need to put this in as a caveat. But in order for us to do anything today, we're going to have a working definition. So today, for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to call artificial intelligence. This is a system that leverages machine learning algorithms to uncover patterns or statistical regularities within data that are useful for performing some task. I tried to make that as non-technical as possible. We're going to be getting into a case study about AI. You do not need to know how machine learning works at depth in order to do this exercise. If you're getting down into the weeds of like, what is our loss function, you went too far. So just keep it at a high level for this. As I mentioned, normally if we're doing a value analysis, you would elicit that from stakeholders. For the purposes of scope, we're actually just going to use Microsoft's AI principles here because they're pretty good and encompass a lot of the concerns that people might have. So the first would be fairness. You want to treat all of your stakeholders equitably and prevent undesirable stereotypes and biases. So we've already talked about this a little bit with models that might be racist or sexist or prioritize some stakeholders over others and treat some unfairly. Reliability, this may seem obvious, but sometimes isn't, is that the system should be able to avoid worst case scenarios, even in the incidents where they're rare. Like, it is not ideal if you're building a radiology AI for you to misdiagnose even 1% of patients. So you want your systems to be reliable. Privacy and security. Again, you want to be able to protect the system from misuse intentionally and to be able to protect against possible data leaks. Inclusion, this will be the idea that you want to empower everyone and provide opportunities for feedback. So what are the channels through which people that might be affected by the technology can give you feedback about how it's impacting them. And the last is transparency. You want to create systems that have outputs that are understandable to the stakeholder groups. So this can be important for engineers for debugging systems. Like if they don't understand why the system has made a particular choice, it can be difficult to figure out how to mitigate that. It's also important for users. So if you think about, hypothetically, a system that is determining whether someone gets a loan or not, and you tell them no or you tell them yes, you should be able to have a basis on which you have made that decision so they can understand why that's made. Okay. We're going to play a game here. I have a QR code to access the slides. We're going to be doing a game called Judgement Call that's designed for product teams to think through how to prioritize some of these 6 ethical principles within the design of an AI system. If we were to imagine a system that uses facial recognition to verify that a ticket holder at a concert venue does indeed hold that ticket. This is an example of a 5-star review. I love this ticket app. It's a lot faster than the digital paper tickets. The facial recognition weirds me out a little bit, but the app seems really secure. There's 2-factor authentication settings, and it's default PIN protected, and you can delete your data at any time. So in this case, this person who wrote this review kind of took the general scenario and thought about some specific features that might fit with that. So I'm going to present you with an intentionally vague AI scenario, and then you, as the person writing the review, can employ some creativity to think about what specific features might pertain or not pertain to that value. Okay, the AI startup Stork is developing a chatbot for providing therapy to parents experiencing postpartum depression. The application is informed by forms of therapy that are known to be effective treatments for postpartum depression, such as cognitive behavioral therapy. The therapeutic content delivered to the users will be predetermined and will be developed by Stork in collaboration with clinical experts. However, in order to lend a more naturalistic, more typical therapeutic context, it's also going to leverage under the hood some machine learning natural language processing techniques that responds to when the user puts a free text response in, like, I'm really sad. It will then give you some sort of empathic response back that mirrors what a real human therapist might do in that context. I'm going to give you maybe a minute to think of a couple of different stakeholder groups that fall into that direct, indirect, or excluded stakeholder. The dichotomy may not be perfect, so if you're like, I'm not sure, it's fine. All right, dealers, I would like for you to shuffle up those stakeholder cards and randomly pass one to each member of your group. Do the same for the rating card and also do likewise for the ethical principle card. Once you have your set of 3, I want you to now take 5 minutes to write a review from this stakeholder's perspective for that ethical principle with that rating. Once you are done reading the reviews from the group, and even if this comes up as you're reading it, I am offering a couple different discussion questions that you can come up with here. Are there both positive and negative reviews of the same feature? Are there any concerns that you might not have thought of had you not gone into this sort of perspective-taking exercise? And this last one is going to be particularly important. What are some changes to the product that you might make based on the exercise that you have done? Hopefully this was somewhat instructive. I'm going to ask you, if you're comfortable with me using your review card in subsequent workshops, just leave it down and I'll pick it up. If you're not, don't leave it down because I'm going to take it. So thanks so much for everybody again for doing this. Hopefully you came away with some ideas of how you might be able to incorporate this into your practices. I've got my information up here if you'd like to reach out. I'm also legitimately, if you want to talk to me in a meeting, hit me up. I love to chat with you about what you're up to and what your concerns are. Great, and I'll share these slides with Patrick and other folks here so they can get them out to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.